I refused to give money to my parents when they needed it the most, even after they had helped me my entire life. And today, I feel like a monster because of it. For as long as I can remember, I always knew we were humble. We weren't rich, not even close, but I never felt like I lacked anything. My parents always found a way to provide me with everything I needed, and that included much more than just food and clothes. They gave me opportunities. My father worked from sunrise to sunset, taking extra shifts and accepting any side jobs he could find. My mother, just as dedicated, juggled two jobs to make sure I had something they never had, a quality education. They believed that studying was the key to a better future, so they did everything they could to enroll me in the best schools possible, even if it meant constantly living on the edge financially. But as a child, I never realized that. To me, my life was normal. I went to school like everyone else, had lunch packed in my backpack, and wore sneakers that weren't the most expensive, but weren't the worst either. My parents never let me see the weight they carried. I didn't notice the overdue bills, the nights my mother slept less because she took on another shift, or the days my father came home exhausted but still sat with me to help with my homework. And the funny thing is, I always had an entrepreneurial spirit. Maybe it all started with a game that marked my childhood, Habbo Hotel. I was completely addicted to that game. Anyone who has played it knows how it works. To stand out, you needed money, the famous Habbo credits. And I wanted status in the game. I wanted the best furniture to create popular rooms, to make deals. But I didn't have a credit card, and my parents couldn't afford to spend money on things like that. So I started thinking of ways to earn it on my own. I remember when I was about 10 years old and discovered that I could resell Habbo coins within the game. I would buy cheap items and resell them at a higher price, negotiate with players, and make a profit. In no time, I was running my own little empire in the game. And that's when I realized something. I loved it. I loved the idea of entrepreneurship, of making deals, of earning money independently. And while I was there, fascinated by a virtual world of negotiations and strategies, my parents were in the real world, working tirelessly to ensure I had an education that would take me much further than an online game ever could. I love them more than anything. If I could have, I would have done something for them even back then. But for years, I never realized just how much they sacrificed. They never let me see the burden of responsibility they carried. But as time went on, reality hit. And when I finally managed to make enough money to repay everything they had done for me, what happened was the complete opposite of what I had imagined. If I had to describe my teenage years in a few words, I'd say they were a mix of admiration, ambition, and ignorance. I saw my parents as true heroes. They always found a way to fix everything, always made sure I had the best opportunities, even when it was clear they couldn't afford it. I grew up admiring their strength while also believing that the world worked in a much simpler way than it actually did. I didn't realize how much my parents struggled to keep our lives running. To me, it was as if they had some kind of superpower. Money appeared when it was needed, bills got paid somehow, food was always on the table. It didn't matter if my father came home with red, tired eyes, or if my mother went days without a break. Everything just seemed to work out in the end. And I never bothered to understand how. While they were constantly trying to balance finances and keep everything together, I became more and more fascinated with the world of business. My interest in entrepreneurship, which started with Habbo Hotel, only grew over time. I didn't just want to work a regular job and earn a paycheck. I wanted to be someone big, someone who had complete control over their financial life. That's when I discovered financial gurus on the internet. Like any curious teenager who spends too much time online, I started consuming videos about wealth, success, and investments. It didn't take long for me to become completely hooked. Every video, every motivational quote, every story of someone going from rags to riches pulled me in. I believed it all. I absorbed every piece of content as if it were a sacred manual for success. And of course, it wasn't just videos. I started reading finance books. Rich Dad, Poor Dad was the first. I felt enlightened as I read about the difference between assets and liabilities, about how the rich don't work for money, but make money work for them. Then came Secrets of the Millionaire Mind, which talked about the mindset of wealth and how our thoughts about money shape our lives. With each page I read, my mind raced with ideas about how I could escape mediocrity and build something huge. I thought I was smart, really smart. While my classmates were worried about parties and relationships, I was busy planning my financial future. I took notes on strategies, thought about ways to start businesses, and imagined my life 10 years from now, already rich and independent. But at the same time, something strange happened. I started seeing my parents differently. Before, they were my heroes. Now, after consuming so much financial content, I started noticing mistakes in what they were doing. Why was my dad still working so hard when he could be investing better? Why was my mom stuck in exhausting jobs instead of finding more profitable alternatives? Why weren't they reading the same books as me? It was as if suddenly I had learned something they had never been taught, and that made me think they were making terrible choices. But I was just a teenager who thought he was wise just because he had read a few books and watched some videos. The truth, which I only realize now, is that I was being naive. My parents weren't dumb. They weren't doing things wrong because they wanted to. They were surviving. The real world doesn't work like it does in finance books or in motivational videos from millionaire gurus. It's not just about thinking like a rich person or investing better. People born into poverty face obstacles that someone from a comfortable background will never fully understand. But back then, I didn't see that. I knew my parents had financial problems, but I never really cared. To me, it was just another phase. I believed they had everything under control. After all, they always had, right? I had never lacked anything, so why should I worry? I saw my dad sit in silence, staring at the bills on the table. I noticed when my mom seemed more exhausted than usual after a long day. But I never asked if they needed help. I never tried to understand the burden they carried. Because in my teenage mind, money was just a matter of mindset. And if my parents were always struggling, maybe the problem was how they thought about money. Today, that thought embarrasses me. I didn't realize my mother was sacrificing her own health just so I could continue attending the good school they had chosen for me. I didn't notice that my father was wearing himself down more and more each year from all the heavy labor. I didn't see that they were slowly sinking, all to give me a better future. And I, in my peak teenage arrogance, thought they just weren't thinking about money the right way. It's hard to admit this now. Back then, I only cared about my own plans. I wanted to be rich, successful, independent. My parents? They could keep figuring things out, as they always had. It took me years to understand how blind I was. But at the time, I was still fully committed to my dream of entrepreneurship, convinced that I knew exactly how the world worked. And while I was preparing for my great journey to success, my parents continued living one day at a time, carrying a burden I would only come to understand much later. That's when my life took a drastic turn. After spending years consuming books and videos on finance and entrepreneurship, the time came for me to decide my future. I was still young, full of ambition, and determined not to rely on anyone. After finishing my studies, I took a public service exam and, to my surprise, passed. It felt like a dream come true. Job stability, a guaranteed salary, benefits. It was everything someone from my background could ever hope for. My parents were proud. To them, this was proof that all their sacrifices had paid off. I had finally secured a stable position, free from the hardships they had endured their entire lives. But deep down, something didn't feel right. The problem was, I didn't want stability, I wanted freedom. I wanted to put into practice all those entrepreneurial ideas that had been growing in my mind since childhood. Being tied to a fixed job with a salary cap felt suffocating. The longer I stayed in that job, the more I felt like I was wasting my potential. So, after several months, I made a decision that many would consider reckless. I quit to start my own business. My parents were surprised, but didn't criticize me. They simply asked if I was sure. And with the arrogance of someone who thinks they know everything, I confidently said yes. I explained that I was tired of depending on a fixed paycheck and wanted to build something of my own, something big, and they supported me. Even though they didn't fully understand what I was trying to do, they stood by me. At first, I was filled with confidence. I invested all my savings and launched a small business. I was convinced that, armed with the knowledge I had gained from books and financial gurus, I would soon turn this project into a thriving company. But reality hit me hard. Entrepreneurship wasn't as easy as the books made it seem. The market was ruthless, customers didn't appear as expected, and expenses were far higher than I had anticipated. Within months, my business started sinking. I tried everything. I cut costs, looked for ways to boost revenue, experimented with different marketing strategies. But nothing seemed to work. Each month, money became scarcer, and the bills piled up. And yet, my parents never stopped supporting me. They saw my frustration, saw that I was on the verge of failure, but never once discouraged me. Instead, they kept reassuring me. Every time I came home feeling defeated, my father would say, "Everyone who has succeeded has gone through struggles first. Don't give up now." My mother comforted me, telling me everything would work out, that I just needed to keep pushing a little longer. They stood by me, believing in me, cheering me on, while I didn't even realize they were drowning in debt themselves. It was only when I started paying more attention that I noticed something strange. Despite working for so many years, even earning enough to live with a basic level of comfort, my parents were always in debt. No matter how much money came in, they could never seem to get ahead. And with all the arrogance I still carried, I decided I was going to help them. After all, hadn't I read all those finance books? I knew about investments, budgeting, and how to manage money. I felt entitled to give them advice, as if I had discovered truths they had somehow missed. So I started giving them financial tips. I told them to stop spending money on unnecessary things, that they needed to invest smarter, avoid installment payments, cut down on frivolous expenses. I spoke as if I had all the answers, as if their financial struggles were simply due to poor money management. What I failed to realize was that I myself was going broke. I, who thought I was so financially savvy, who wanted to teach my parents about money, was on the verge of bankruptcy. I preached about financial intelligence while my own business was collapsing. And that was when I finally saw the truth. My parents' problem was never just money. I could have given them any amount, paid off all their debts at that moment, and within months, they would have been in debt again. Because the problem was deeper than that. It wasn't just about how much they earned. It was about how they viewed money. My parents had grown up in an environment of scarcity. Their entire lives had been about survival, about making ends meet, about making sure I never went without. To them, money was never a tool. It was a constant source of stress, something that was never enough. They had become accustomed to always living on the edge. Whenever they had extra money, instead of saving or investing, they would spend it on something they had wanted for a long time. Because after years of sacrifice, they felt they deserved a little happiness. And I couldn't blame them for that. They had spent decades denying themselves luxuries. How could I expect them to suddenly start acting like the wealthy businessmen from the finance books I've been reading? At that moment, I finally understood. Money isn't just about numbers. It's not just about cutting expenses or making smart investments. Money is tied to emotions, to fears, to deeply ingrained beliefs. And in that moment, I realized my parents didn't need my financial advice. They needed me to understand them. And for the first time in my life, I truly saw my parents. Not as heroes, not as people who were making mistakes and needed fixing, but as human beings, people who had spent their entire lives fighting, failing, learning, and doing the best they could. From that moment on, everything started to change. But it would take time before I fully grasped the true impact of this realization. After the failure of my first business, I spent years trying to rebuild myself. I didn't want to go back to a traditional job. Entrepreneurship was still my goal, but this time, I needed to be smarter. That's when I fully immersed myself in the world of digital business. I spent months studying, testing strategies, and investing what little I had left in courses and tools. I worked with affiliate marketing, tried dropshipping, created monetized blogs. I experimented with everything. Some projects brought in small returns, while others were complete failures. During this process, I started recognizing my past mistakes. I had been arrogant. I thought I knew everything about money just because I had read a few books and watched some videos online. But nothing replaces real experience. The business world doesn't follow fixed, predictable rules, and I had learned that the hard way. While I was trying to rebuild myself, my parents continued living as they always had. The difference was that now, they were elderly and even more consumer-driven. They hated the idea of living with restrictions. Even when money was tight, they would rather spend everything than go without something. To them, not having meat on the table was unthinkable, even if it meant taking on more debt at the grocery store. If they could pay in installments, they did. If they could borrow money, they would. And this became an endless cycle. I saw what was happening and tried to help. I didn't want them to struggle, so I started offering suggestions. I proposed a realistic financial plan tailored to their lifestyle. I showed them how they could save without giving up everything, how they could reduce small expenses and slowly get out of the financial hole. But every time they saved in one area, they spent more in another. If they managed to lower their electricity bill, they would use the savings to buy something unnecessary. If they avoided a new loan this month, by the next month, they had already taken out another one. It was frustrating. I tried talking to them, explaining, showing the numbers, but it was like talking to a wall. To them, any extra money meant an opportunity to spend more, never to save. At that point, I decided to stop insisting and fully focus on the digital world. After so many failures, I finally got it right. I created an online store that started doing extremely well. It was a simple idea, but well executed. I learned from my past mistakes, and this time, I built everything with strategy, without rushing, and without letting blind enthusiasm take over. And suddenly, I was making real money. It wasn't an overnight success, but sales were growing steadily. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was in control. But when the money started coming in, things got serious. My parents, who had struggled with finances their entire lives, saw my new reality, and they started looking at me differently. And that's when everything began to change. After that conversation, something changed. My parents kept saying everything was fine, that they understood my decision. But in the small interactions of daily life, I could feel that something had shifted. The phone calls became less frequent. They no longer shared their problems with me as openly as before. Whenever money came up in a conversation, there was an awkward silence, like an invisible barrier had formed between us. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, that nothing had really changed, but the truth was undeniable. Something in our relationship had cooled. There were no fights, no direct accusations, but things simply weren't the same anymore. And even though I kept telling myself I had made the right choice, the guilt kept growing inside me. I wondered if I was being selfish, if I was truly abandoning my parents after everything they had done for me. They weren't bad people. They weren't reckless with bad intentions. They had just spent their entire lives trapped in a cycle of debt and constant expenses because that was how they had learned to survive. And now, with all the financial stability I had worked so hard to build, I was refusing to help them. Every time I saw them, I noticed how much older they had become. My mother didn't have the same energy as before. My father moved slower, with more exhaustion, and that only made my guilt worse. But at the same time, I knew that if I gave in, if I started covering their bills, if I bought the house in my name for them to live in, I would never be able to escape from that situation. Because this wasn't temporary assistance. It was a pattern that, once started, would become my responsibility forever. And deep inside, I felt anger. Not toward them, but toward the situation itself. Why did it have to be like this? Why were there people who could simply live their lives without carrying the financial burdens of their families? While I had to choose between my own stability and my parents' well-being, it was a constant battle within me. With each passing month, my business grew. I was making more money than ever. I could afford luxuries I had never dreamed of. But all of it came with a bitter feeling, as if I was failing in the most important way. Because what was the point of success if I couldn't use it to help the people who mattered most to me? But at the same time, what was the point of helping if it meant sacrificing my own financial future and repeating the same cycle I had worked so hard to break free from? It was a question with no answer. And while I kept battling with my own thoughts, my parents slowly started to drift away. Not in an obvious way, not with fights or arguments, just with silence. A silence that hurt more than any accusation ever could. With my store growing and my financial stability secured, I decided it was time to take the next step in my life. I wanted to expand my business, invest in physical stores, and, most importantly, move to a new city to live the life I had always dreamed of. I had worked too hard, failed, learned, and now I wanted to enjoy this new phase with more freedom. During a phone call with my parents, I told them about my plans. I explained that I was moving, that I wanted to invest in new opportunities, and build something even bigger. They listened carefully, without interrupting. But at the end of the conversation, the inevitable question came up. "And the rent here?" My mother asked in a cautious tone. It was something I had expected. Until now, I had been paying their rent. Not because I was obligated to, but because I could afford it without affecting my finances. But now, with my move, I didn't want to keep paying two unnecessary rents. I knew that would set a precedent I didn't want to establish. So I was honest. I explained that it didn't make sense for me to keep paying if I wasn't going to be there anymore. That I wanted them to learn how to manage their money without relying on me. If it weren't for my store, how would things be today? I asked. There was a pause on the other end of the line. My father took a deep breath. My mother stayed silent for a few seconds before responding. "We understand." And they changed the subject. But I knew that, deep down, everything was not fine. They didn't say they were hurt. They didn't make a scene. But I could feel that the conversation hadn't been easy for them. And after I hung up the phone, I just sat there, lost in my thoughts. I worried about them. That was why I kept pushing the conversation about finances. It wasn't coldness. It wasn't selfishness. It was because I knew that if they didn't learn to control their spending, their situation would never change. And I didn't want to carry that weight forever. I had no intention of committing to a monthly financial responsibility. I knew that once I started, I would never be able to stop. And even if they never explicitly asked, the expectation would always be there. But at the same time, I felt like a monster. Saying no wasn't easy. Watching my parents grow older and choosing not to take on their financial burdens wasn't easy. And even though I knew my decision was rational, even though I knew I wasn't wrong, it still hurt. Because this was the consequence of being the first in the family to have money. There was no reference, no example to follow. I was the only one who had managed to break out of the cycle of debt and financial struggles. And now I carry the weight of deciding what to do with that position. And it hurt, because deep down, all I really wanted was for things to be different. I've been carrying this guilt for a long time, and no matter how much I try to ignore it, it always comes back. So today, I decided to write this here, hoping someone might give me a different perspective. I refused to give my parents money, not because I couldn't, but because I knew that if I started, I would never be able to stop. Because I understood that their problem was never really a lack of money, but rather the way they had always lived. But at the end of the day, does that even matter? My parents spent their entire lives sacrificing for me. I never lacked anything. They always made sure I had the best opportunities, even if it meant living with financial struggles themselves. And when I finally had the chance to give back, I said no. Not because I wanted them to suffer, not because I am ungrateful, but because I knew that if I took on that responsibility, my money would never be just mine again. It would be ours, and I would never be able to say no without feeling the way I do now. I see them getting older, and I wonder if I'm doing the right thing. If I were a good person, wouldn't I just pay for everything? Shouldn't I make sure my parents have a comfortable retirement, free of financial worries? Shouldn't I give back everything they did for me? But at the same time, if I do that, wouldn't I just be enabling the same cycle? If I cover all their bills, buy them a house, or send them money whenever they need it, wouldn't I just be creating a new dependency instead of actually helping them? People say that when someone is the first in their family to make money, this kind of burden comes with it. But no one told me how much it would hurt. No one warned me that I would feel guilty every time I said no. No one told me that I would lose sleep at night, wondering if I was being rational or just a heartless, selfish person. No one explained that having money doesn't just mean freedom and comfort, but also carrying the invisible expectations of those who have lived in financial scarcity their entire lives. And the worst part? My parents have never demanded anything. They have never guilt-tripped me. They have never thrown their sacrifices in my face. And maybe that makes it even harder. If they had yelled at me, if they had been ungrateful, maybe it would be easier. I could just cut ties and move on with my life. But they simply accepted it. They say they understand. They change the subject whenever money comes up. And it kills me inside. Because deep down, I know that they don't understand. They don't understand why the son they sacrificed so much for, the son who now makes more money than they ever did, chooses not to give them financial support on a regular basis. And I ask myself, does that make me a monster? I'm not a billionaire. I'm not someone who could fix all their problems without feeling it in my bank account. But I'm also not struggling to pay my own bills. I live well. I can help them. But I don't. Because I know that if I do, I'll never be able to stop. Because I know it wouldn't be a solution. It would just be the beginning of a new financial relationship where I would always have to be there to cover their needs. And I want to live my life. Does that make me a monster? Or am I just doing what any reasonable person would do? I'd really like to know what you would do in my place. Because honestly, I don't know what to think anymore.